You finally did it. You got yourself this beautifully described pack of coffee. You prepared it. You take the cup, you drink it, and it tastes really, really bad. I'm sure you have this experience before, and this is why in this video we are going to deep dive into coffee, what is influential when it comes to the taste of the coffee that you have, and how you can find the right coffee beans for you. I'm Ingo from Roast Travels, and now let's go. What most beginners are doing wrong when they get into roasting is they care a lot about the machines they are using. They care about the rate of rises, about the way heat is being transferred and all that. But they forget the most influential thing when it comes to the taste of your coffee, and these are the green beans that you are using. Imagine it a bit like in another picture. If you want to do a nice barbecue for your friends, you buy yourself a nice barbecue. You have thought a long time about whether you should take coal or gas or electricity. You are now set up with your barbecue. You remember your friends, last time you met them in holidays, you had these wonderful sausages, so they really love these sausages. You go to the butcher, you then get the nicest meats that you find there. You find a beautiful lamb rack. Take this lamb rack, put it on the barbecue. Your friends are there, and they're all a little bit disappointed because they were looking for sausages. This sounds a bit absurd, I know, but at the end, it's the same thing that we are doing with coffee. We really care about the techniques behind it, but then we are getting the wrong raw material to get what we want to achieve then at the end. So you have to be, first instance, aware of what kind of coffee you like. So understand what are your preferences if you're a home roaster, or if you're then roasting for others, if you're roasting for friends or commercially, then understand what these people or the people that you're roasting for really like to have. Is it more that you like to get a classic Italian espresso, or do you have like an everyday batch brew, or are you then really looking for fruity filter coffees or for iced like cold brew coffees that are more fruity or so? This is the point where you have to start, and then you have to create the beverage that you want to achieve with the right beans, then also with the right roasting style and the preparation, of course. And in this video, we are going to have a look at the right beans. If you are a little bit into specialty coffee, then you might have seen before these SCA flavor wheels. And this SCA wheel, it has really a broad range of tastes on it. There are some like fruity, berry notes, so it always gets a bit deeper. You can say fruity, red berries, and then from red berries you can get into, is it more raspberry or is it strawberries or whatever, and then you have floral aspects. You have on the other hand then also nuts, like for example walnuts, hazelnuts, or chocolate, light chocolate like milk chocolate or dark chocolate. But at the same time you have also on this wheel then burnt flavors or some unpleasant flavors that taste like phenol or rubber or all that. And most of these flavors are then coming from the green coffee beans. Of course, when you're talking about burnt flavors, then we're more into things that have been affected by the roasting style. If you're then in these phenolic flavors, then we are coming from the green coffee defects. And then if you're more in these pleasant flavor notes that we have like citrus, berries, floral, chocolatey, these are then aspects that are coming from your green coffee beans. And how you can find the right ones for you is something that we are going to cover now. We are going to have a look at 6 aspects that are going to influence the taste of your coffee. One is then the species or the variety of your coffee. Second one is then the processing. Then we are going to talk about origin. Next is then the altitude where your coffee have been grown on, which is like close to the origin, but it's a bit a particular topic. And then we are also going to talk more about quality, so grading of your coffee, as well as then aging and then also storage of your coffee. And the point here is we can always talk about quality of coffee, so better quality or worse quality, but at the end, then what you want to get is really individual. Referring back to this specialty coffee association that we've been talking about before, the SCA also then developed a sheet, a form with which you can then grade coffee and give the coffee certain points. So you're going to then talk about the acidity of your coffee, how strong is it, how pleasant is it, the sweetness, the body, how it feels when you drink it, the aftertaste, the whole then uniformity or balance, so how clear or easy it is for you to get certain taste or notes out of your coffee, or is it a bit more complex? So you have quite a lot of factors that are then being judged. Usually that's being done by so-called Q graders, so people that are then have a certain certification and that are then calibrated on these aspects. Then you get some points from 0 to 100, which are then defining the quality of your coffee. So when we're above 80 points, we usually and then are talking about specialty coffee. And then from there, we have a range of 80 to 100 points. We are in this video not talking about coffees that are below. So we stay then with this quality where we are then in the range of specialty coffee. But here it is then when you're inviting your friends over, for example, that are not into specialty coffee, or your family, and you're serving them a coffee that has 93 points, for example, then it's quite likely that these people are not going to really appreciate this quality, because these coffees then most likely will have some acidity in it, or some notes that are just a little bit too far away from what the people expect from a coffee that they have been used to. Therefore, within this range, you really have then to find the coffee that you like. This could be very likely somewhere around 83 points, when the coffee is that most people like. Therefore, this SCA scale might be a good range for you if you're really into specialty coffee, maybe even if you're into competition coffee. So if you're then in the premium segment, then this might give you an orientation. But if you are not, if you're just here to roast coffee that most people out there like for everyday use, then you really have to put that aside and really focus on your palates and define then what is the coffee that I want to achieve. So let's start and talk about species and variety. There are about 120 species of coffee out there, but most of them are not being used commercially or not being drunk. It's actually mainly two that are used commercially. One you surely have heard of is Arabica, which is the most common one. And then we have another one to which you probably refer as Robusta. But then biologically, we are talking about coffee Canephora. Robusta, the differences between Arabica and where the expression Robusta is coming from is something that you find covered in a lot of information out there on the internet, on YouTube. So I'm not going to deep dive into that. But just to be said is that in general, Arabica has more sugar and also more oils in it, so the coffee taste is mainly transported by oil. So in general, Arabica has just a broader range of flavor notes, is usually then more flavorful. So while Canephora in general is a bit less expressive in their flavor notes. There is a lot of research going on, and then also different processing coming in Canephora. So there is some development here, but still in general, Arabica is more flavorful than the Canephoras. There are then also other species that you might have heard of, like for example Liberica or Excelsa. We had made a nice video with Tobias Siever where we talk about Liberica and Excelsa. You find it right here, where we deep dive into these topics. And then there are some coffee species that are more than in the specialty or competition grade, like for example then Eugenides or Stenophilia or some other varieties, which are really, really nice when it comes to the cup quality, but are a bit more difficult to grow. Therefore, they're not that popular because they're just really expensive. So we are now having a look at the range of Arabicas, but it doesn't stop there, because below there are also a broad range of varieties, varietals, cultivars when it comes to these coffees. This is the same for Canephora and also Arabica. We are now focusing on the Arabicas. So you have some naturally grown varieties, but you have also some cultivars that are then being developed. And the reasons for that can be, or used to be, historically more than about how much you get out of a harvest, how safe they are against diseases like, for example, coffee rust, how easy they are to harvest, then also some general cup qualities like sweetness, how people like them. So for example, bourbon coffees have been more sweet than typicas. But the more and more we're getting into this third wave of coffee or specialty coffee, we are then really developing cultivars or are using then varietals from one country in another country just for the flavor notes that we get out of it. So for example, SL28, SL34 have been coffees that are typically grown then in Kenya, for example, but now you find them also in Colombia or in Guatemala or in other places where people are then getting these blends in order to develop a particular flavor profile. You can imagine the difference is a bit like if you have different apples. So for example, if you get a Granny Smith apple, it tastes really different than, for example, from a Gala or a Braeburn. One has more acidity, one has much less, more sweetness that is pronounced, some is a bit more balanced, but they then also have different flavor expression. And this is quite the same then also for coffees. We are not deep diving too much into this because you also find then a lot of blogs or informations out there. I can always recommend you the Coffee Atlas from James Hoffmann, where he then really deeply goes into different coffees, different origins and so on. So this is a really, really great resource, not just so that you have some words or expression that you heard before. Some typical coffees we are talking about are, for example, bourbon, Typica, Caturra, Catuai. These are more the classic ones, but then there are also some that provide a more expressive flavor profile, like for example the already mentioned SL28, SL34, Pacamaras, Maragogypes, or then also the Gesha coffees, which are really popular. These are then things that I would really recommend you to just give it a try. For example, Gesha coffee is incredibly popular when it comes to the whole competition scene. They are providing then a quite different flavor profile from most of the other coffees. So give this coffees a try, judge it for yourself if you like it or not. That's then the sensory that you have to develop. Next thing we are going to talk about are coffee origins. And here you have on one hand different countries, but then you have also within different countries, different regions. So for example, you have in Colombia then Huila, Tolima and so on. And all those regions then have also a different flavor profile. But then the more and more we deep dive into it, like example, we did it already for years with wines. We are getting more and more into that also with coffee, where we then have different farms or then also different lots on a farm where we get different flavors. So we got from big to small. And of course, meanwhile, you can say that there is quite a mix-up. There are technologies and beans and processing that are being used from other countries in another country. But in general, there are still quite typical flavor profiles. So if you have a coffee from Ethiopia, in most cases, you know a little bit what to expect and how they are different from a typical bean from Brazil or India or Indonesia. So you have for each of these countries then kind of typical profiles that you can learn about, try about, and then get into it. And then of course, then on the like micro or macro level, then there are also differences that are coming to more and more. We get into the specialty coffee or third wave of coffee. So things that are influencing the taste in a country are on one hand then geographical or geological aspects, like for example the climate, and the climate can be then macro or also even micro if you're in particular regions where you can have a different climate from farm to farm. But in general you have for a country a climate, you have then also the soil that is different, you have then also the conditions of other plants. Is it more that you have more shade? Is it less shade? How high is it? Is it more mountainous or is it a bit flatter country? But in addition to those aspects, you also have then traditions and technologies that you have in different countries. So, for example, for a lot of countries, you have quite strong then associations in coffee that have developed, that are then supporting the farmers in technologies, in knowledge, so that you get better qualities or then coffees that are more to the taste, that are for a broad range of people, while in other countries then, for example, this is a bit missing and the farmers are more on their own in developing then coffees, technologies and all that, which can be really difficult. Therefore, you have then also just from the structure that you have in a different country or on also the traditions in processing, which we are going to talk about, or also then farming, you have then different levels for each country. The next thing, I already mentioned it, is the so-called processing. This is something that I realize a lot of people are underestimating and are not really then into it. You might have heard the expressions of washed coffee, natural coffee, honey, maybe other processings. But I realized then when I'm doing workshop or talking to people that for a lot of people this is still a little bit overwhelming. You find a lot of information out there in blogs, in videos, so you can really deep dive into it. But just to give you a short understanding or a short framework, the processing is then what's happening after the harvest of your coffee. Coffees are like a cherry, so we also talk about coffee cherry, and they actually look quite the same than the cherry that we get, like where we then eating their flesh, and we have a stone inside. In coffee, we don't have one stone or seed inside, we have two seeds usually, so they are positioned on the opposite of each other. So like a bit when you have a peanuts, you have then the flatter side of the coffee. This is where the seeds are facing each other, and then they have the rounder part of the coffee. And now the processing is the way these seeds are getting out of the cherry, of the flesh, and then also the way you are drying the coffee. Because when the coffee is leaving then the farm, the seed is going to have about 11% of moisture content. This is the moisture content that we found the best for coffee in order to keep the quality and the taste. When it's then fresh out of the cherry, it has a much higher moisture content, so it has to get down to this 11% and get rid of the fruit flesh around. And in general, there are two traditional ways of doing this. One is the so-called wash process, where you then remove the flesh, the cherry, and then you're drying the seed without it. And then the other one is the natural process, where you're going to dry the coffee with the flesh around and then remove the flesh at the end. So taste-wise, the difference is that in washed coffee, you have much more clarity. You taste much more the terroir, so where the coffee is coming from, makes a much bigger difference, and you have much more clarity in the profile. Often these coffees then have a more pronounced acidity because the sweetness is a little bit lower in the body. They're a little bit lighter when you drink it in comparison to natural coffees. In natural coffees, you had a lot of fermentation that has been going on with the sugars and the fruit flesh that has been around the seed. So you have then more body, it's more full-bodied in your mouth. It usually also have more sweetness. But you also then have these fermentations that are covering a little bit the terroir. So naturals, they taste a little bit the same no matter where they're coming from. You also still have differences, but they get a little bit more even from the fermentation that is happening. So you have less the clarity and the terroir that you get out of a natural in comparison to a washed coffee. So these are the traditional ways of then processing it. And of course, then also within these processes, there are then some differences in the way you do it. If you want to deep dive into it, by the way, also get the book Green Coffee from Chris Corman. In my opinion, the best book about coffee out there. There you find everything then explained in detail. But then people went into some mixture of these forms, and you might have heard a lot of expressions like honey coffees, pulp natural, semi-washed coffees. And then you find in detail some differences between them. But what's always in general is that the coffees then have been dried with a part of the fruit flesh around it. So it has been partly removed and then just dried with a part of the fruit flesh, so that you're somewhere taste-wise in between the washed and the natural. You have more clarity and more terroir than, for example, in the natural. On the other hand, then you have a bit more body and a bit more sweetness in the honeys than you have in the washed coffee. So you're kind of somewhere in between. This has been like the classic processing for quite some time. And in the last years, we have developed or found a lot of so-called experimental processings coming in, which then remarkably changed the taste profile of your coffee. It has started with anaerobic fermentation, where you then put the coffees in tanks. They're anaerobic, you have no air or oxygen in it, they're closed tanks, and then the coffee is being fermented that for, I don't know, 48, 72, 96 hours. And the coffees then are getting flavor profiles that you haven't had before in a coffee, like for example, it could be cinnamon or raspberry or really pronounced flavors in a coffee. And then from there, we have developed then into other technologies that we got, for example, then from the wine, so like carbonic maceration. But people have also started then to put in yeast into these coffees, that supports the fermentation, like for example yeast from wine, champagne, or other yeasts that are then even increasing the way flavors are being developed or pronounced. And meanwhile, there are then also some processes like anaerobic, carbonic maceration, maybe also even yeast are quite accepted within the specialty coffee, or even then most competition coffees are developed in one of these experimental processings. Now we also get then into processing that are a little bit more controversial. One, for example, are then co-fermentations, where you put anything other into the fermentation pot. We have, for example, a co-fermented coffee, which is then really pronounced in peach taste. So during the fermentation, they have really then put pieces of peach into the coffee, and the coffee has taken over these flavors, and you have a really strongly pronounced peach flavor in this coffee. Or then more and more we're also getting into infused coffees, but these are then just processing that are quite experimental, quite for a small range of coffee, while most of the coffees are still produced as washed naturals or honeys. And one thing I really recommend you, and we will be getting into that and much more, is whenever you buy a coffee, no matter if it's green coffee, or roasted coffee, or then a cup of coffee in a specialty coffee shop, look that you get as much as you can get on information about the coffee, so that you can find out where it's coming from, what variety it is, how it has been processed. Look that you get more and more single origin coffees, where you then have one coffee and you can then really build your database of flavors out of it and find out, do you like more naturals or washed coffees or experimental fermentation? So really try to get from now on just coffees where you find out this information. Look that you get more single origins, where you then really can develop your palates and learn about your coffee preferences. Then going back to the origin, or where the coffee is coming from, we also have the aspect of altitude or density in coffee. The reason for that is usually the density of the coffee is related to the altitude. It can also have different aspects, but what's in general is the temperature of the environment where your coffee has been grown is influential on the density of your bean. So if you're a bit higher, it's a bit colder, the coffee is growing a bit slower, and then it develops more sugar content, also more flavor notes. And this is why high-grown coffee in general has a bit a reputation of better quality of coffee. Also, when you then find expressions for coffee, you find this then directly in the description of the coffee. Especially for Central American coffees, you find descriptions like, for example, in Guatemala, then hard beans or strictly hard beans, soft beans. This is related then to the altitude where the coffee has been grown. Or in Mexico, it's then, for example, high grown, strictly high grown, so that you know then where the coffee is coming from, you know what to expect when it comes to the density of the coffee, how to roast them, and then also the flavor profiles that you can expect out of this coffee. Density is something that we covered, by the way, in a video that you find here, also down in the description, where we then deep dive into coffee density, how to roast the coffees for special densities, and then also how to measure the density of a coffee. This is something that you should really take care of, especially then when it gets into roasting of these particular coffees. Now we have been talking about how the environment and the processing can influence the taste of the coffee, but there are then also other aspects. This is then more related to the processes and the quality that you get out of a coffee, about everything that is then happening after the processing. And these are things like sorting, like grading of the coffee, and then also packaging, freshness of the coffee. So let's have a look at the sorting, grading, or green coffee defects. Coffee is a natural product. So when you harvest it, when you have processed it, it is really then different. Like, for example, when you buy apples, I mean, of course, most of us, we just see those beautiful premium quality apples that we get in the supermarket. But of course, when you get them out of a tree, they are then different in shape, they are different in ripeness, and they have to be then sorted. So some of these apples are then getting into fruit juices, some are then being used to feed animals, and the nicest one, the most beautiful one, are then landing in our supermarkets. And you can imagine a bit like the same for coffee. You have then coffees which is like perfectly coming out from a tree. You will have then coffee which is not yet ripe enough. you will have coffee that is overripe, that will then have moldy tastes. So first thing is we are going then to sort this coffee so that we only get the ones that are then in good quality, in this good range, that are not underdeveloped or overdeveloped when it comes then to the growing on the tree. This is one thing that is happening when the coffees are being sorted. But then there is also, when you get this coffee, that you can have different things within the beans or within the bags. If you have really, really low quality of beans that you're buying, it can even happen that you have like some wood, some stones, even some metal or plastic parts in it, and then a lot of green coffee defects as well. And the more expensive and the more cautiously the coffee has been then sorted, the cleaner it is. So of course, if you get a good cup of coffee, you should never have stones or like woody parts or plastic or whatever in your coffee. It should be just clean, the green coffee beans. But there is then also a grading when it comes to the defects that you get in a coffee. You find also a lot about defects in the internet, so just Google for it, and then you find a description. So what you're doing then when you're grading the coffee or when you're checking how well a coffee is graded is you're taking 300 grams of a coffee and then you're checking about green coffee defects. There can be defects that are really influential when it comes to the taste of a coffee. So if it's moldy, for example, then this is going to have a strong influence on the whole cup. So these defects have then really a bad rating, and of them there shouldn't be any in your sample if you have, for example, a specialty coffee. But there are also then defects that are not too influential when it comes to the taste, like for example if you have some insect bites or a little bit of broken beans, and from them you can have a little bit more in your 300-gram sample depending on the quality that you get. And then depending on the quality you get a grading, like for example grade 1 are the highest quality, grade 2 up to grade 7, for example, in Ethiopia or in other countries. Then you have different ways this is graded, like European preparation, which is then a bit better quality. Or you find it then for each country a bit differently. You can also deep dive into that if you want, but usually you should look that you get coffee with a good grading so that you can get then a coffee which has less defect in the cup. And then there is also the size of the beans. So usually when you buy a coffee, you are going to be informed about the screen size. So you find expressions like screen 15, 16, 17, 18. And this is usually then referring to, like sieves that are then sorting the coffee according to their size. There have been some information about whether smaller or bigger beans are better in taste. Usually then when you do blind cupping, it's a bit hard to distinguish and really say smaller or larger beans are better in quality. But what's important for you as a roaster is that you get beans that are quite uniform. They don't have to be perfectly all the same, but they have to be quite uniform, because just imagine if you have green coffee that you're going to roast and some beans are really large, some beans are really small, then what's going to happen is that the small beans are already burned while the big ones are still underdeveloped. Therefore, you want to have an uniformity in the size of the bean so that they're all developed about the same when you're roasting them. So this is then the grading and also the screen size of your coffee. And another thing is really influential on the taste and the quality of your bean is the age. So imagine coffee is a product that is grown in most countries and is being harvested usually like once a year, or in many countries you also then have a second harvest, so you have a main and then a smaller harvest. In some countries it's a bit more that you have then coffee being harvested at different times, like for example Colombia, but in most of the countries you really then have the one main harvest, or a bigger and the smaller ones. Then the coffees are being picked, they're being processed, they're being then exported, then they're on the sea for quite some time, then they're landing in the warehouses, then they're landing at the roastery, and then the roasters are storing them because they want to cover then the needs for a year. Therefore, you must know that the coffee is aging, and the older it is, the more it gets a taste which we call then baggy. So if coffee is then too old, it gets a taste that reminds you of these burlap bags, which is a bit baggy, quite an unpleasant taste. Therefore, you must look that you get fresh coffees, just taking into consideration that it always takes a bit of time from the farm, from the harvest, until it lands then with the traders, with the warehouse. So you always have a bit of range, and green coffee is luckily not aging as quickly as roasted coffee does. So you know when you have coffee roasted, or even then when the coffee is already ground, how the taste will disappear quite quickly. For green coffee beans, it's luckily not that quick, but still you get aging where you have to be careful with. But the aging is also dependent on how you're storing the green coffee beans. So what I recommend you, or what is the general recommendation in order to keep green coffee bean fresh for a longer time, is store them in plastic bag. We're also selling the coffees, for example, in these EcoTech bags, and I'm not 100% happy with it for a sustainability aspect, but at the end, this is really the packaging which is keeping the coffee the freshest and the best. And then even if you're buying coffee then in a 60 or 69 kilo bag, you usually see that there is this burlap bag outside, but you have to be aware or take care of that the coffee inside is also then packed in a Grain Pro or EcoTech or any other plastic bag, so that the coffee is then kept fresh. Because this is on one hand then protecting the coffee from getting too dry, also getting too wet, or then also then being affected by pests, or also then by other flavors out there. Like in these plastic bags, the coffee is then protected the best. And what you also have to be careful is to store your coffee in a cool and dry environment, and also then protected from lights. So light is really bad for your coffee, heat is really, or warm weather is really bad for your coffee, and then also a missing protection is bad for your coffee. So make sure that you store the coffee in this condition in order to keep it fresh for a long time. Now I gave you a framework on what is influential when it comes to the taste of your coffee, and you might be now overwhelmed a little bit or asking yourself where to start. So Rome wasn't built in a day, so you can then really develop yourself, but it's just important that you then really take care of this aspect and learn the longer, the more. And the place where you can start immediately right now is if you're starting to get single origin coffees. This means that you don't have blends, but you have coffees where you then really know where they're coming from, what coffee it is, because this will help you massively in order to develop your palates and then also your coffee database or your coffee preferences. So look that you're going to roasteries, maybe smaller roasteries, where you get information about your coffee, where the coffee is coming from, what varietals it is, how it has been processed. And these are generally then the information you get, maybe also the altitude. Then also when you go to specialty cafes, look that you know about the coffees that you're getting. So what coffee is inside, how has it been processed, where it's coming from. And the more you then give it a try, the better you will develop then your knowledge about coffee. Another thing which is then really helpful is going to so-called cuppings, because it really helps if you have then coffees side by side. You might know it also then from other beverages, like for example wine. If you want to develop your palates, just helpful if you have then different cups side by side. Same as for coffee. There is, by the way, a so-called cupping procedure. You find more about it here or down there. I also made a video about that. So try coffees side by side. Usually you do this then with a spoon. And there are then events where you can then really find about this. On one hand, there are then educations like coffee sensory educations where you do that. Or also then you find probably some traders or coffee companies, roasteries that are offering cuppings, public cuppings, where you can then go and try different coffee beans. So make sure if in your city you find events like this, that you go there. Other places which are really then great places to find out about it are coffee festivals. So usually on coffee festivals you find then green coffee traders or roasteries or people that are offering cuppings so that you can try coffees side by side and develop your palates. There are then usually national festivals in Switzerland, Germany, France, London, Amsterdam. There are a lot of coffee festivals out there, but there are also then the big ones like, for example, World of Coffee. If you go for a World of Coffee, you have just hundreds of possibilities to do cuppings and try different coffee beans. So make sure you go to those festivals and then try these cuppings, dry coffees side by side, look where it's coming from, get information about it. This will massively help you then to develop your skills and your knowledge about coffee. But you can also do it yourself as a home roaster, for example. What I would recommend you is you've now invested in your equipment, you have your roaster, but take also some money aside because the green coffee bean you're using is really influential. So get some different green coffee beans. Look that you get coffees in smaller portions so that you can get more coffees, cup them side by side, and then develop your preferences. If you're roasting commercially, then what you're doing is you're usually getting samples, 50 to 100 gram samples before you're buying coffees. I would not recommend you to get samples in order to develop your pellets. That's quite unfair to the producers or coffee creators because these samples are expensive in logistics and then also for the coffees themselves. But when you're buying a coffee, before you're deciding for a particular coffee, you always get a 50 to 100 gram sample. Usually you get a green sample and you have a sample roaster. Some traders are also offering roasted samples, and then you decide for a coffee before you buy then a bag or pellet or whatever amount you're going to buy. I hope this video was helpful for you. If so, then please give it a like or subscribe, because if you're then reacting to the video, then I know which of the content you like and of which I have to produce more. Also, if you subscribe to our channel, you will get then updates because we are releasing videos every week when it comes to roasting and coffee. Also, if you're interested in then trying different green coffee beans, head over to our website. We have a broad range of green coffee beans that we are offering, from more traditional coffees up to more specialty coffees. So we have Canephoras, Malabars, Brazilian coffees, but then also some like co-fermented coffees or like special washed coffees from Kenya and so on, so that you can then really start developing your pellets and then also find something that is the right coffee for your taste. Also, if you're generally interested in coffee roasting, head over to our website, roastrebels.com. We have coffee roasting machines that we are offering. We have green coffee beans, but also a lot of other equipments, and then a lot of information and content about coffee that you can find on our website. If you want to contact me, have any particular question, then also head over to our website. You find everything on roastrebels.com.